Hello, everybody. It is Sunday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, here for a breaking news edition of the Penn State Football Podcast. I'm here with Joel Haas, our daily Collegiate and Post-Gazette Nittany Lions insider. Amid widespread reports at this point, nothing official as we're recording, but widespread reports that Penn State is set to hire Jim Knowles as its defensive coordinator. The national champion with Ohio State this past season. Penn State plucks him. Ohio State wanted to keep him, but I believe I've got Pete Thamel in front of us saying Penn State signing him for $3.1 million on average over 3 years. Joel, I mean, that's what a lot of head coaches make in college football these days. This is a huge play from Penn State and a huge statement about, how they feel, I think, about next season.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it a little bit when, there were a lot of key players who opted to come back, whether it was Zakee, Wheatley, Zane Durant, Dennis-Sutton on the defensive side, and then obviously Drew Allar, Singleton, and Kaytron Allen coming back on offense, among others. And so obviously, you kind of got that vibe that Penn State was loading up for the 2025 season. And that's kind of what Ohio State did this year en route to winning a national championship. And that's kind of what Michigan did 2 years ago for their national championship. You look at those rosters, there were a ton of veteran guys, ton of leaders who had NFL draft potential and opted to come back. I think you can credit that in part, that change to NIL, but you can certainly see the trend here that's been put forth by some other Big Ten teams. And it seems like Penn State's doing its best to go all in on next season.
Yeah, just the particulars. Obviously, Ohio State's defense was, number one in the country in a lot of categories this season. Dominated Penn State in Happy Valley, prevented them from scoring an offensive touchdown. If it wasn't for the way the Ohio State offense completely immolated itself against Michigan, Joel, I think we'd be talking about this as one of the best defenses of all time. Obviously, they struggled a little bit in that Oregon game, but that was really it. The entire season, come back, dominate the Ducks in the Rose Bowl. They're really only getting garbage time types of points. So what did you learn from this Ohio State defense this season that you think can translate to Penn State next season with all those playmakers they have coming back?
Yeah. I mean, I think Ohio State has a decent gap in terms of talent over Penn State on the defensive side of the ball. Just when you look at, how many guys they have across the board, and that's no knock on Penn State because, obviously Penn State had a great defense this season as well, and will have a great defense next year. But I think maybe the biggest thing to me is just how quickly Knowles was able to get a turnaround there at Ohio State, because they had always recruited well, on both sides of the ball and had those talented pieces on defense. I know they had a string of a bunch of very talented defensive ends that came out of Ohio State pretty much every year. But their numbers weren't necessarily there. And you touched on it a little bit, but Ohio State the year before Jim Knowles got there was, and I just looked into it, was about 30th in points per game allowed and 50th in yards per game allowed the year before Knowles got there. And within 2 years, they were a top 3 defense in yards and points per game allowed. So obviously there was some pretty significant underperformance before Knowles arrived, just given the talent on the roster. But he was really able to kind of serve as a catalyst and get those guys, in the right spots and coach them up to really achieve their potential. And obviously we saw that play out on the field this year with how dominant Ohio State's defense was throughout the season.
Are you looking for any talent to follow Jim Knowles from Columbus to State College? Obviously, we know that Ohio State's probably going to have to reload on the defensive line. So, and that's a place that Penn State is strong. Maybe that weighed into Jim Knowles' decision a little bit. But they still have some players in other spots. Do you think any of them moving with him, or do you think they say this Ohio State team's still pretty good? And now Ohio State's going to have some money to spend on players now that they're not spending $9 million on a coordinator over the next couple of years. How do you expect that fallout to unfold?
Yeah, it's tough for me to really see any movement or predict it at this point. I think part of that is Ohio State loses a lot of its defense to the NFL after this year because, like I mentioned, a lot of those guys could have left last year as well and chose to come back. So whether they're out of eligibility or just, declaring for the draft after a national championship and kind of ending on a high note, I think a lot of that defense is leaving along with Jim Knowles. And, looking across the roster, I think the one name that obviously stands out is Caleb Downs, who for my money is the best safety in college football and was only a true sophomore this past season. So he's, obviously has to stay in college. for at least one more year. I mean, that's obviously a huge name. And if you're Penn State, like, why not take a swing there? I don't know if it's realistic to expect that to happen. And I think we've seen less in college football players following coaches. I think maybe at head coach it happens a little bit more often, but for like a coordinator, for example, I don't think players tend to necessarily follow their coordinators too much. We've seen it with Penn State when they lost, whether it was Brent Pry or Manny Diaz or now Tom Allen. I don't think Penn State lost a single player to either of those schools. I think it's more about a head coach leaving. That can potentially bring some guys with him. So I wouldn't anticipate it at this point, but maybe more so on the recruiting trail. Maybe some of those guys who are kind of split between the two schools and play on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe some of those decisions start to lean toward Penn State. So that's where I would look.
Yeah, and I think especially it'll be interesting to see how things unfold in the portal, not necessarily former Ohio State guys, but this is the type of move that gets the attention of guys in the portal and guys who are looking for opportunities to play at a high level. So Penn State might not be done in that respect before we get back to the beginning of next season. Joel, I want to talk a little bit about the financial implications because this is extremely out of character for Penn State, to say the least. You and I talked about their ability to keep Kaytron Allen, Nick Singleton, Drew Allar, those guys you mentioned on the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, you stepped up in a big way in terms of NIL to keep those guys happy, to keep them out of the NFL. Now you make this move. To me, this is saying that the donor class is kind of feeling itself after this old Orange Bowl appearance and is taking seriously, like you said. We saw all those guys come back to Michigan and the impact it had. We saw all the guys come back to Ohio State and the impact it had. It really feels like the whole of government here is seeing the next season as kind of an all-in moment for Penn State. Or is this a sign of the donor class and kind of what we had been talking about on the podcast as well, of now that the money can be a little bit more out in the open in college football, and you can pay the players that maybe you've got some big money donors who weren't previously interested in giving guys money in an envelope, now working through the collectives and working through the athletic department directly in the case of this hire, and saying, we've got the most CEO graduates in America at Penn State, and now we're going to start leveraging that Rolodex into big results in terms of personnel.
Yeah. The money is definitely there, and I'm, not necessarily sure where it came from, because it's been long documented, how Penn State has kind of struggled in NIL given, its situation. And I don't think the NIL was never as bad as maybe some portrayed it to be. I think Penn State was probably in the top 20-ish range, which is, not terrible. But when you're at a university like Penn State, you're expecting closer to top 10, top 5 range. And I think, I don't know if you can pinpoint whether it was, the wins the team had this year, when you look at, a couple of playoff victories, which were, top 10 wins, or whether it was the losses maybe against, Ohio State, Oregon in the Big Ten championship, and then ultimately Notre Dame in the Final Four. I'm not sure whether it was the wins or the losses that kind of finally moved the needle for some of the bigger donors, but it's pretty clear that there's money coming in, because, Jim Knowles, I would argue, is the best coordinator, offensive, defensive, in all of college football. And the numbers certainly play that out when you look at, the contract he just signed, where he's now the highest paid coordinator in college football. And there were a lot of universities who were in on this, whether it was Ohio State. I believe $2.75 million was a number that was floated out that Ohio State offered to retain him, which would have made him the highest paid coordinator. But it was not the $3 million number that Penn State was willing to offer. And Notre Dame got in the mix once Al Golden was hired away. Heard that Notre Dame was potentially interested in Knowles. Oklahoma is another school that's looking for defensive coordinator that got thrown into the mix as well. So for Penn State to come out,
he has history out. He has history, because obviously before Ohio State, he was at Oklahoma State. I remember, Joel, I covered West Virginia, Oklahoma State for a game when the Post-Gazette was back to covering West Virginia for a little bit, and West Virginia got a couple big plays on the first drive, drove down the field, scored on the first drive, and they got almost nothing the entire rest of the game. And I'm not just talking points. I'm talking they didn't move the ball. I think they had 118 yards or something of total offense. And there wasn't a huge talent disparity there between Oklahoma State and West Virginia necessarily. You had an offensive-minded guy on that side of the ball, and Neil Brown as the coach down there. It was one of the most suffocating performances I'd ever seen. And that was still when he was at Oklahoma State, let alone now that he had the talent at Ohio State. So I think, even that history going further back a little bit suggests that, it's not just that he earned this reputation by getting Ohio State to the national championship, by, having some great Ohio State defenses the last few years. He earned that job in Columbus with a great career before that.
Yeah, I think he was a big name, even going back to his time at Oklahoma State. And what I thought was really interesting was Lexi Linderman actually tweeted this. She works with me at the Collegian. But when Jim Knowles' defense at Ohio State held Penn State's offense without a touchdown against an Andy Kotelnicki-led offense, it was the first time since 2021 that Andy Kotelnicki's offense had not scored a touchdown in a game. The last time that it happened was when Kotelnicki was at Kansas and Knowles was at Oklahoma State, and Knowles held Kotelnicki's offense without a touchdown. So those are the last two times that Andy Kotelnicki's offense was held without a touchdown. Both came against Jim Knowles, which I think speaks to how good both coordinators are, really.
Yes, and I think we have to talk a little bit about next year's schedule here as well, Joel, because it is highlighted by Oregon and Ohio State. Obviously, Ohio State is the team that you have played every year as a division rival until this past season when the divisions went away. But, to the extent that Penn State's played any team in the Big Ten as often and in big games, it's been Ohio State. Michigan has, been good in spurts, but they have not been as consistently good as Ohio State has been in the years Penn State has struggled with them. So obviously there's a ton of familiarity there from Jim Knowles' perspective. And then you also have Oregon as your big home game next season. Jim Knowles played the Ducks twice in 2024. Do you think there was any eye toward, that familiarity there and that understanding of the teams Penn State is going to have to beat, not only to get back to the college football playoff next season, but to win the Big Ten and maybe set themselves up with a favorable draw?
Yeah, it's huge because, obviously there's, the impact that it has on Penn State, but it's almost a double win because you're taking away Ohio State's, best coordinator, which is obviously kind of hurting your rival there. And obviously the two will play next year. So on top of that, Ohio State now has to look for a defensive coordinator. And we're also so late in the cycle just due to the nature of how things played out. Knowles did not want to entertain any offers until after his season had concluded. And obviously Ohio State played the longest season that any team could possibly play. And so that kind of set the whole clock back. And now that Penn State has stolen Knowles away from Ohio State, there are fewer options, remaining out there at defensive coordinator for Ohio State to look into. I've heard rumors that they potentially stay in-house. I think a lot of people are high on their safeties coach there, but regardless, there's just limited options for Ohio State at this point. So you put the Buckeyes in a tough spot heading into next year. And that'll be obviously a really interesting game where Knowles is, intimately familiar with all the players on that defense, or at least a majority of them that, he either recruited, coached, whatever it may be. And so that, could potentially give Penn State a leg up as well. That'll be an interesting game. It's at Ohio State, which makes it a little bit tricky, but Penn State also gets that game off a bye. Whether that's a good or bad thing historically under James Franklin, you can, leave that up to interpretation. But regardless, I think that's a huge advantage for Penn State against the one opponent that Penn State fans probably want to beat the most.
Let's wrap the show up on this, Joel. Obviously, this is a huge move for James Franklin individually. I'm not going to be naive here. I mean, you make a guy the highest paid coach and highest paid coordinator in college football history. In the case of Jim Knowles, then it's about the money. But is there a secondary endorsement of what you saw from this program this season? If Penn State, loses gets upset in the first round by SMU. If it doesn't make it in the playoff at all and maybe drops that game at USC where things got tighter, drops that game in Minnesota where things are tight, and you don't get in the field of 12, is this a move that Jim Knowles makes even for that amount of money? Or do you read it as an endorsement of what James Franklin was able to accomplish in getting to the Big Ten title game and then winning a couple of playoff games, albeit against, lesser competition in Boise State and SMU?
Yeah, winning those games certainly helps just in terms of the image of the brand. And obviously there was talk of a potential rematch between Penn State and Ohio State in the finals if Penn State was able to hang on to that lead against Notre Dame. Not to bring up bad memories, but I think at the end of the day, it most likely came down to money, because if Knowles was just looking for, which program can I be the most successful at, I think he probably consider staying at Ohio State a bit more strongly. Just, they're the reigning national championships. And as of last I checked, they have the best odds to win the national championship next season as well. So they're kind of the favorite to repeat. And, given that, I think if Knowles was just, keying in on where he can, win national championships and find the most success, I think he potentially stays at Ohio State. I think the money really had a bigger impact on this one because, obviously $2.75 million is a lot of money, but, $3.1 million is even more money. And there's a significant gap there, actually. So I think that's really the big factor in this.
Yeah, but I think there's also a level in which, if you're a guy like Jim Knowles, you don't hitch your wagon to someone you don't believe in either. And I think that's, I would agree with you. I think Ohio State's probably the better place straight up to win over the next 3 seasons. But I think there is some level of saying, hey, like I see it with Penn State here. Yes, the money is speaking as maybe the primary factor, but listen, the guy's got a proud reputation. He's not going to want to embarrass himself either. So I think it's really interesting too, Joel, because this is a guy that, probably a lot of programs would have loved to be a head coach. And it kind of reminds me on some level of Ohio State's move to get Chip Kelly. Was the offensive coordinator at UCLA, had a Power 5 Big Ten head coaching job, gave it up because he just wanted to coach some ball. And that pays off for Ohio State. I wonder if you see any, similarities there as well in terms of, Jim Knowles can just run a defense and doesn't have to worry about running a program. And that's part of the benefit of having a kind of CEO type like James Franklin as the head coach.
Yeah, I think that's just the way that college football is moving right now. And you can find a lot of different examples of that. Manny Diaz, even though he, did make the move back to being a head coach now at Duke, had cited, during his 2 years as Penn State's defensive coordinator, that it was nice to kind of take a step back and just have to focus on one thing and, not have to be dealing with all the outside things and all the other factors. And Tom Allen said similar things when he arrived at Penn State, that it was nice to just be able to focus on defense. He told us, actually, it was pretty recently that, he's just a big film guy. He just likes watching film. And when you're a head coach, you don't necessarily have time to come through all that. But when you're a defensive coordinator, you can just sit down for hours and watch film, which is something that he really enjoys doing. And I think that's a similar sentiment that, whether it's Chip Kelly or a bunch of other coaches around the country, I think just the amount of pressure that's being put on head coaches, especially with the recent changes of the transfer portal, where you now have to recruit your own roster, you have to keep your guys within the program, and tampering is rampant, and it's well documented that pretty much every team tampers in some capacity, and so you have to worry about other schools trying to poach your players. You have to worry about negotiating NIL deals. When you go out to recruit, it used to be about a bunch of different things, like how much playing time the guy can get, how close they can be to home, things like that. Now, when you go out to recruit, the first thing that kids want to know is how much can I get in NIL at your program? There's so many different factors now in college football that make being a head coach extremely difficult. And I think for a lot of guys, they've decided that, while there may be significantly more money, it's much less stressful to stay in a coordinator role.
Especially when you're making $3 million. That's a number that is still going to astound me for several days that Penn State comes up with for a coordinator. I think there was most of Penn State history. You haven't even had a head coach. Joe Paterno never made more than $1 million in his base pay. Now you're paying Jim Knowles 3 times that. Just interesting and different times in Happy Valley. And it really does feel like this is a program that is gearing up to give next season its best shot. So everyone, please stay tuned. Please subscribe to the channel. I expect Joel and I will be back sometime this week for reactions. We have more details, possibly an introduction from Jim Knowles. So subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. Have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy the conference championship games in the NFL, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.